Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are located. I'm Jerell Hill. I'm the Dean of the School of Education. Here at Pacific Oaks, we're located just maybe 9 miles north of LA. We're in a city called Pasadena. So I'll pass it over to my colleagues.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. It's morning in California, so do forgive me if it's afternoon where you are located. I'm Dr. Carlene Fider. I am full-time faculty in the School of Human Development at Pacific Oaks College. As Dr. Hill mentioned, we're located in Pasadena. And my role, along with teaching, is overseeing the thesis process for our master's students in human development.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Veronica Estrada. I am core faculty in the School of Human Development, and I oversee Fieldwork. So thank you very much for allowing us this morning to present. So I pass it over to my colleague.
We are so grateful to have an opportunity to share with you some of the best practices that we have been instituting since COVID-19. We actually have had lots of conversations as faculty and as a community to talk about how we can best support our students. So this current study that we have looked specifically at how our community partnerships, online readiness of our students, and those instructional practices that we have were effective in pivoting practices during the pandemic. We are, for those of you who aren't familiar, wanted to give you a little bit of background regarding Pacific Oaks so you understand us a little bit more. So as we go through this presentation, you have some context in which to hang some of the comments that we will be making. We are a small institution, liberal arts institution that has as our mission diversity, inclusion, respect, and social justice. And because of this, we endeavor to ensure that all our students as well as faculty have access to the best sort of information in order to support their learning practices. We think it's important also to mention that our environment our campus rather, fosters a welcoming and open environment for students, faculty, and staff. And as we were thinking about this transition to virtual learning in this space, we wanted to ensure that our students had the best access. Because we are working with a lot of students who are adult learners, we had to keep that in mind and ensure that our structure was supporting their specific needs.
So in terms of our background and our theoretical framework, we were looking at bell hooks. Our school, we have something called PO pedagogy that models what bell hooks calls engaged pedagogy. And so according to bell hooks, her theory really states that it's very necessary to have a transformative process for holistic learning. So what we do at Pacific Oaks is that we allow students to interject and use their complex lived experiences and use their voice to connect with the curriculum. But then again, according to bell hooks, with her theory, she really asks for professors to have mutual vulnerability. So for us to build trust with our students, we also share our own lived experiences, and that's very powerful because that connects trust. And this facilitates that dialogue with students to move them from critical theory to critical thinking to critical action. And also what's very important is that as educators, we have a responsibility to create a culture that supports awareness, and we need to understand the emotional intelligence.
I'll continue until we get Dr. Estrada back. So as she was indicating the importance of that pedagogy that bell hooks speaks about, it's very important for us as we think about supporting our students to create a culture that supports optimal learning. This idea of reciprocal sharing between instructor, professor, as well as students is extremely important. And we don't just see that in our classrooms. It is something that is done community-wide when you think about how administrators work with administrators and faculty with administrators and such. That is a part of what we hold at Pacific Oaks College.
Looking at some of the other theoretical frameworks, the other unique feature of Pacific Oaks is we have a children's school attached to our college. So again, we really can see experiential learning and also looking at the process of assets and needs. So when we look at our system, we're really trying to ensure that the instructional design is student-centered, right? Because a lot of times when we had a pivot, there were people willing to lean back, but we were asking our faculty to lean forward and lean in to really not teach to the screen, but teach through the screen. So that's really kind of the results of what the pivot really demonstrated for us at Pacific Oaks. So as we move through this, I'll let Dr. Fider go into the methods that we've used.
It was important for us to have conversation, and that is why we use autoethnography, because we not only had conversations with each other, but it was important because we believe that students' input is important to have conversations with students, have conversations with other stakeholders in order to get feedback as well as feed forward to see what was working, what needed to be tweaked through this process to ensure that all the individuals that were part of this felt comfortable. It's important too to think about when we think about autoethnography and the importance of it, that we also had opportunities to self-reflect, to talk together as a team, to see what was working, what wasn't, to see if there were any blind spots that we had specific to what we were seeing as we embedded some of these things into the courses that we had to teach. As I mentioned earlier, if you could advance the slide, Dr. Hill, thank you. As mentioned earlier, I oversee the thesis process at Pacific Oaks College, and we typically, students engage in qualitative research, various types of qualitative methodology. Now, when one thinks about qualitative research in a pandemic, it's a little bit more challenging because it's important to be able to not only have conversations with individuals, but potentially observe. And that was taken away from us because of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders. Because of that, we had to troubleshoot and say, how could we support these students in this endeavor to allow them to have this rich experience while still allowing them to get the access to the information that they needed to complete their master's research in human development. What I found to be very, very helpful after conversation with my colleagues, as well as with my supervisor and such, was the importance of collaborating with other institutional resources. This was a pivot that we had thought about previously, but we were propelled into this during the pandemic. The library or writing center specialists or tutors, as well as myself, became very, very close in this process. It was important for us to create a wraparound type feel for our students in order to provide them with succession and triaging, if you would. Conversations that would involve academic writing would be important. Ensuring that they had access to library resources, because no longer could they come on campus, everything would be happening virtually. We got to the point where we had opportunities at least twice a semester since the pandemic started, for presentations that were collaborations through the library and the learning center or writing specialists and tutors to support students. Drop-in visits to classes. We're currently having on the first Monday, second Wednesday, and third Saturday of every month, the library will have office hours so that students can get support directly. We've had amazing support from those entities, and not just the support, but the communication between the three entities. Once a month, we'd meet to talk about what was working, what wasn't working, what needed to be tweaked. Again, all ensuring that our students would have the support that they needed as we shifted. The standards that we had in terms of the outcomes, those didn't change, but how we went about ensuring that those outcomes were supported was something that certainly had to change. Another thing that happened for us before I allow Dr. Estrada to speak was this idea of having opportunities for students on our branch campuses and in our offsite cohorts to also come together in the same classes. So instead of having just the Pasadena students working together, now we had opportunities for Pasadena and San Jose students to work together, as well as some of our offsite cohorts that we have in Southern California.
Good morning. So for field work, we had 2 weeks to pivot and move everyone from a face-to-face model to a virtual cohort-based fieldwork project model. And so what I was doing was I was researching different institutions to see what they were doing. And a lot of institutions were canceling the fieldwork requirement because they couldn't move fast enough. Our institution believed in me and said, Dr. Estrada, whatever you need to do, whatever creative project you're going to do, let's do it, because we cannot cancel classes. We need to be there for our students and move them forward. So Pacific Oaks is part of a 5-college affiliate consortium. So what I ended up doing was reaching out to our affiliates to see if they had time to supervise our students. So prior to the pivot Fieldwork, students got to self-identify location and their project. During COVID, we became very structured. We created cohort models. We had a supervisor. We created the project. We put students together to work with a certain project, and everything became structured, which decreased the stress level for students. And what became very clear was this bi-directional communication system that we had to create between myself, which is the fieldwork supervisor, the fieldwork coordinator with the fieldwork supervisor and the instructors. We met weekly. We made sure that we were on the same page. We saw a lot of the digital divide became very evident for both faculty and students, because not all faculty had the equipment to do the work from home. And then we realized that a lot of our processes were not digitized. So we had to really not only find the fieldwork, find the supervisors, find the projects, but also pivot and create digital documents to make this more of a streamlined process. So what we realized was the more structure we had, the more communication we had, it decreased the anxiety level of students, and it worked wonderfully. We realized that this is going to be now the standard of practice. So from this model, we kept improving it. So by the time we went into summer, we built out more field work locations virtually with community partners. So we went from 8 community partners to 13 community partners. We kept building and building and building. And because we're based on social justice and advocacy, we're able to find nonprofit organizations that really aligned with the mission of the institution and the concentration of the student. And so even though it was such a heavy lift in the beginning, and we were just, every day was different, we didn't know what was going to happen, that constant communication and that structure, really, we were able to move this field work face-to-face based learning practice to a digital virtual cohort-based model. So.
Excellent. Again, as you see, the connection between our human development and School of Education. As we know, this was the first time that pre-service teachers completed their practicum in a remote setting. And during the study, we were able to see some of the discrepancies with the teaching performance expectations when they were actually in the classroom, and when we had the pivot last March, you saw some discrepancies between what was occurring during distance learning and in the classroom. Specifically looking at TPE2, when you talk about assessing learning or looking at the total child or whole child, it's really difficult to make social emotional learning connections in a remote setting. You can't necessarily assess student performance really well. So again, we saw candidates having some challenges with fieldwork supervisors as well as mentor teachers. But what it did, it really spoke to the fact of connecting in-service and pre-service through their induction program, which was formerly known as BITSA. We really need to intensify coaching and professional development. Also, there's an individual development plan that is given to districts as teacher candidates finish their program. The other thing that I can really speak to is family engagement. I think the piece of having candidates connect with families and learning that is just more communication is beyond the report card and citizenship grade. It really is kind of a two-way communication system you need to have with families. This also really reminds us the importance of looking at Maslow before Bloom, because I've seen in school settings that we've actually switched some of the concepts of Maslow, where students have to achieve to belong instead of belong to achieve. So this again really reminds us that we do have to look at Maslow before we go into Bloom. And I'll go pass this over to my colleagues to discuss clear expectations and some of the self-assessments.
So what we found in terms of our results, how did these things work for us? It was important for us to set very clear expectations. Dr. Estrada alluded to those weekly meetings she had with our fieldwork coordinator, as well as with the faculty that oversaw thesis, or rather that oversaw fieldwork. And the very same was true when I think about thesis. Very clear expectations for students. Another thing that was vitally important was, outside of the involvement from other departments, was to ensure and engage administrators who could therefore then support the process. Having weekly meetings with thesis instructors is something that happened. Emails were sent out regularly, they still are. And outside of that, another key part I think about clear expectations was recording of videos. We did a lot of that to ensure that students, in the event that they had technical issues, just like we've had today, they could still go back and get access to this information. So pre-recording, recording during classes, and then also recording shorter lectures or to provide students with opportunities to get access to that information in the event that there were bandwidth issues. Again, the demographic that we serve don't always have access, as Dr. Estrada mentioned. And because of that, we wanted to ensure that they could still get access to the same information wherever they could, however they could, if they weren't able to stay online for the entire period in order to engage with their colleagues.
Absolutely.
Right, and then
go ahead. I'm sorry, Dr. Estrada, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dr. Hill.
So I was just going to this last point here. When we look at some of the biases, implicit and explicit biases that we experience, I think prior to the pandemic, I would always tell teacher candidates, it's relationship before rigor, and the pivot was relationship with rigor, because you have to understand that students can thrive in environments with positive relationships. So it can be rigorous, but they still can thrive. And I think that was a really critical pivot, because we know, behavior is a function of the person and the environment. And if the environment changes and the behavior changes, the person can change. So a lot of that was seeing that relationship with rigor during the pandemic as we pivot. Go ahead, Dr. Estrada.
Well, just to echo what you're saying too, and to also thread in engaged pedagogy, is that it's very important to have students express their lived experiences of whatever challenges that they were going through, so they can actually accept the curriculum, be in the curriculum, and then live in the curriculum. So with that, with clear expectations, specifically in fieldwork, we were like, you treat the fieldwork just like a job, just even though it's digital, right? You still have to show up for your meetings. And if you don't, you might get fired from your fieldwork location. So those clear expectations were really important, because even though we were digital, we didn't want to, and we were very, like Dr. Hill said, we were rigorous, and we were pivoting. We still had to have those clear expectations that you still have to perform academically, irrespective of what was going on. So thank you for that.
When we think about some of the implications of the significance of our study, it's so important when we think about community, and that is paramount to engaged pedagogy, is having that community feel, that support. Students need to be able to feel as if that is present for them, even in virtual spaces. When we aren't able to meet in person, how are we ensuring that this is present for them, and that humanization of the digital pedagogy to preserve our students as well as our own humanity? As was mentioned earlier, it's so vitally important at Pacific Oaks that we embrace our experiences and weave those into our, not only how we teach, but how we interact with each other. And it's important, we believe, when we think about the implications, that faculty think more about that, specifically when there are a lot of stresses that our students are navigating. No one could have prepared for COVID-19. And we know that everyone's stress has been heightened because of this experience. How then can we continue to humanize or remain human given the fact that we are using screens?
In regards to fieldwork, what we learned, the implications of the study, is that the institution responsiveness to support the innovative ideas was our success. If we're going to pivot, we need the support of the institution. If we don't have the support of the institution and we know we have innovative ideas, we're not going to succeed. So we're very fortunate to be working at an institution that really supports faculty innovation. Another thing too that we did was work at really focus on equity-focused strategies to leverage technologies. And what we noticed is, in regards to fieldwork, we didn't have a lot of things digitized, like tracking fieldwork hours and project progression. It was before we were always meeting with students. Now it's like digitally, how do we do this? How do we look at all this? That was such a divide. And so we worked really hard to create those communication systems and to create those digitized processes to fill in those gaps. And then also, we also saw that we needed to have a full-time fieldwork supervisor as well as a management system to document all those hours. So that was the gap. And from that, we're moving forward to fill those gaps.
So again, when we look at our student practicum, teaching practicum and our student teaching experience, we really amplified issues that matter, because we know that race and culture matter in schools as we pivot. When we talk about our critical consciousness or our self-reflection, we did want to have students really reflect on their experience, but also we wanted to make sure that they were productive and relevant, but also we wanted to evaluate the impact, because there were some things that in fact pre-service teachers were helping the actual mentor teachers with some of the breakout rooms in Zoom, because they were more familiar with the technology, but also really focusing on being culturally intelligent within the learning environment, but also reframing your thinking in order to improve upon the basic active process of reflection. So again, some of the implications are really relevant to in-service teaching. So we really wanted to make sure that we connected our student interest to what's actually happening in the field. And here are some other recommendations. I'll pass it over to Dr. Fider and Dr. Estrada, and then we'll take questions.
So last Dr. Fider was talking about, it's very important to evaluate our teaching practice and to humanize our digital pedagogy. Today, my internet didn't work. So this is very transparent that there's a failure within the internet. And so this is something where I think prior to COVID-19, I would be so embarrassed, but now this is just part of the process. I'm human, this is what's going on. I'm pretty sure all of you have experienced this. So with that, we have to always preserve our sense of humanity and to really listen to our students' stories. We're welcoming students into our homes. Students are welcoming us to their home. And it's really important to understand that there's this level of trust and transparency that's coming through the digital pedagogy, but it's also really important to how do we create these psychological safe spaces, and how do we remain human and connected to our students in a new platform that now we're doing this digitally.
I think it's also important to think about our student experiences. So when we think about recommendations for future studies, yes, we want to see how we can allow distance learning classes to feel a little bit more in person, create community. But it's also important to think about the experiences of our students and how they are ingesting this. Students may, and Dr. Estrada, we have spoken about this in the past, part of what we would like future studies to look at is the implications or the impact of not having students turn their cameras on. Primarily when we think about the context in which they live. It is a very intimate space. We're all living in spaces now that used to be private, and now the world is being led into those spaces. How has that impacted our student learning outcomes? Given the fact that a lot of students that at Pacific Oaks College may be living in multi-generational households or in contexts where they may not feel comfortable letting people into their spaces. So we have to think about those things and understand that sometimes not having the camera off is actually the best practice for that student, rather than requiring that they have themselves visual on screen.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know Dr. Gloria Latsing Billings talks, she's kind of the architect of culturally relevant teaching. And here are the three proportions. Academic achievement, I think people have, reached consensus around that. The other two areas are really where we need to see a little bit more focused attention: cultural competence and social political / critical consciousness, as another pivot is going to be prevalent in light of the recent activities and the court decision. So now you're going to have to be able to situate those things within the pedagogy. So we'll end it there. I'll stop my screen share and we can start to take questions.
Thank you so much for such an important presentation, especially on that topic of humanizing the digital experience, which has just come to the forefront lately in research and the need for more practices and more research in this area. And I think your research is fitting that need so nicely. I also teach at a faculty of education in Ontario, Canada. So I completely understand that pivot need to move field placement to virtual, and how fast that had to happen. And I just loved your ideas and how you humanized that whole experience. I think that's something we didn't even really focus on. And I was really interested in listening to this. There was the section you talked about the switch to virtual field work, and you had found it decreased the students' anxiety. Did you find, I'm assuming that didn't happen right away.
No.
Yeah, but like, what was that like before? Because we had the same thing. It was just chaos and anxiety and stress. And how did you find that initial sort of hump that, here's all these changes, we have to go into crisis mode to change? And what sort of supports did you provide to the student at that time before you got to that, we're seeing that they're happy, their anxiety is being reduced?
Thank you for that question. I found that I functioned perfect. I couldn't believe that I functioned so well under crisis. And I'm for my strength finders, I'm an activator, an achiever. So all of my strength finders just went, like, it just put me in a great platform. So I just went forward and I talked to my dean. I told her, this is what we're going to do. These universities are not being responsive. It's very expensive. There's not a lot of time. We moved, I think it was like maybe 65 students from bachelor's and master's program into I did a video. And with that video communication, letting students know that they're going to have a supervisor with a project, and it's going to be outlined. So as I was doing the video, I was interviewing supervisors and making sure they had an action plan with weekly action items for the students, so they can know what their project is, how they're going, what the deliverables were, and then we're like, how are we going to track these hours? I'm like, we'll figure that out later. So it's like building the plane while it's flying, right? So what we ended up doing was always communicating with students. And so sometimes I would send out videos. It could be 2 times a week. And just as students were getting the emails or the videos or staying in the loop and being part of this process as we're building it in the back end, that decreased their stress. And so what we ended up doing was we did meetings with students, and then we did meetings with their cohorts and their supervisors, introducing their project. It was a lot of work. And when I think back a year ago, I think I was working 16 hours a day. And then I was like, this is just something that we're going to have to do because we're it. And so the support that I received from the institution was, go for it, Veronica, we believe in you. And then the networking piece within the affiliates, because at Pacific Oaks, we're very relational. And so the support of my colleagues, the support of other colleagues and institutions were like, okay, how can I help you? Everybody stepped up. And so with that, and with just having a plan and articulating it so clearly with students and letting them know this is your role and this is the expectations every week until we're done with fieldwork. You don't have to find your placement. You don't have to even think about your project. Just show up, be your excellent self, and do the work. That decreased the stress level. And I had so many emails and phone calls, and I had to make sure that I responded. I put them first on my list of priorities because there was so many. It was bachelor's and master's students. So, and then I got the support from my amazing colleagues. And so we didn't really have time to think. It was always, we were in action mode.
And then I can second that.
I hope that helped your question.
Absolutely.
So there were 3 things that we did really quickly. The first thing we did was I did an online readiness assessment for students who were traditionally on ground and they took in-person classes. Secondly, we had one of my faculty did tech buddies. So we would pair really tech savvy faculty with faculty who aren't really used to going into Zoom or WebEx or whatever platform that you're using. And then the third piece was also looking at critical reflection. So we continued to reflect weekly to debrief on how things were going. and then also really partnering with school districts to ensure that we were, in fact, able to meet some of their needs because they were doing their student teaching in a remote fashion, just ensuring that our evaluations were accurate, because we took a midterm evaluation and a final evaluation, just so that they could demonstrate the teaching performance expectations per the state for their credential. So it was really interesting, but I thought the online readiness assessment and the tech buddies really stood out in this process, so that people felt that holistic support. But then also making sure that students felt that support, where we just increased our office hours and our availability to ensure that they felt supported throughout that process. Because again, there is a difference between a handout and a hand up. So we're like, we know that we're in just such a critical moment. We hear you. What we're hearing matters, because we really want to listen with this intentionality, because intentionality can improve impact.
And I wanted to add one more thing, Jennifer. I taught all the fieldwork courses because I didn't have time to train adjuncts. So that was part of my plan. I told my team, for this to work, I'm going to teach all of the fieldwork courses, bachelor's and master's, so I can be that consistent piece. So all students can hear the same information. And I just worked with the supervisors and the teacher and it actually worked.
Yeah.
Will I do it again?
All of us did that, because I took over all the thesis classes as well, just so that there was this familiarity. They understood that she knows the process, she understands the process, she can be present. Yeah, we are all looking forward to some sort of vacation. Award. Well, you know what? If you would let our president know, we'd appreciate that.
Yes, yes. This was fantastic. Thank you very much, team. I will be following up with you as well, just for some extra information, if you don't mind. So I'd just like to thank everyone who came into the presentation today, as well as our presenters now and Dr. Chang. Thank you very much.